my name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about the best books that I read last year in 2024, and we're going to start by looking at my statistics for my reading year. I read 100 books last year, so it's pretty easy to divide up the statistics. Of those 100 books, 56 were audiobooks, 14 were physical books, and 30 were ebooks. I'm actually surprised that I read so many ebooks because usually I'm pretty resistant to reading in this form, but I have found some ways that have incentivized this for me, so I think that's why it's a little bit higher than I expected. My average star rating was 3.7 stars, which is still pretty high in my opinion, and my average page count was 216 pages, which makes sense because I read a lot of short poetry collections last year, so this tracks with having a lower page count. My top 3 genres were poetry, literary fiction, and romance. Those were my most read. So now that we've looked at the actual statistics, let's look at the books that I would consider my best books of 2024. I've grouped these into different categories rather than a ranking system because I found that my favorite books of 2024 all fell into some sort of category. So I'm going to discuss them in these small groups. And the first one that I'm going to talk about is Showed Me Love. The first book in this category is Tastes Like Shakkar by Nisha Sharma. This is the second book in the If Shakespeare Was an Auntie series. And I'm kind of confused by the name of that series because apparently these are supposed to be Shakespeare retellings, but maybe they're just not stories I'm familiar with. But regardless, I've been enjoying them. I really struggled with the first book. I didn't like the male main character. This book was the complete opposite. I loved the main characters in this, both the male and the female. And I really loved the journey that they went on through this book because they're adults. They had real problems that they needed to work on to be better together. And I loved that journey in this story. Next is The Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. This is a much beloved cozy fantasy, and it follows this orc who has retired and is opening a cafe and just enjoying small town life. Obviously there's some antics and shenanigans that occur. I really loved this. I thought it was a very beautiful story, mostly about friendship, and I really loved how that was explored through this in finding a sense of community and just showing love in so many different ways to people. A really beautiful story in that regard. The next group that I'm gonna talk about is Finding Community. For this one, it's mostly poetry collections that I read during the Seeley Challenge, and a lot of these reflect on language, culture, and identity. And so it's very obvious to me that the guiding theme for this was mainly community, because those are aspects of community life. But these really stood out to me. The first one I want to talk about is probably the one that I think I felt the most personal attachment to, and that was I Done Clicked My Heels 3 Times by Taylor Byas. This felt like such a love letter to the community that Taylor Byas was raised within, the friends and family members who she has surrounded herself with. And I really loved her prose style. I thought that her poetry really evoked so much emotion, and it's something that I felt like I really related to in terms of the subject matter of her stories and some of the discussions that she feels like almost she's having with the reader. I really loved this. You shouldn't be surprised because Dennis Smith really promoted this book, and they said that like this was one of their favorite poetry collections, and I can definitely understand why. There are parts of this that remind me a lot of Dennis Smith's writing style, but I don't mean that to discredit Taylor Byas's. I think that Taylor Byas has an amazing, unique prose that really stood out to me in this, and I'm really looking forward to whatever they publish next because I think that this is a really talented poet who's only just starting, and I love that. Next, let's look at Quilting by Lucille Clifton. This was my first of Clifton's works, and I don't know why I had felt such a pull to this. I think because of the cover and the name, it just sounded so cute and like cozy to me, and I really had no idea that this was a collection of her poems over the course of like a decade, and I loved how she incorporated community into these poems. So much of this is just like a discussion about the African American experience and African American communities, and I really loved how Lucille Clifton really shines a light on so many different aspects of African American culture, and the use of AAVE in these poems was really nice to see as well. Like, I just thought that this was a really well-rounded collection that, although spanning across years, that's a lot to incorporate into one collection, but I think it showcased almost like the evolution of the communities that she herself was raised in, and like different issues that sometimes were the same over time and sometimes evolved into different things. And yeah, that sense of community was just so strong throughout, and I am looking forward to reading more from Lucille Clifton after this because she has such an extensive poetry backlog. So this has left me itching for something more from her. Next, let's look at All Heathens by Marianne Chen. This was fascinating to me because the author inserted these, I think they're like parts of like journals or like excerpts from like letters, something like that, from this like Spanish explorer that went to the Philippines and wrote this really, really racist account of his experiences there. And Marianne Chen uses this to then juxtapose like what she has experienced in the West, growing up as, I believe her family is like Chinese Filipino. So she talks a lot about the fetishization of Asian women and Asian culture, and discusses how like these racist travelogues from the past and like these conquistadors or conquerors, colonizers that came to these countries and had these terrible ideas. Those ideas just didn't go away. They are actually still being perpetuated in white supremacist societies, and how this has had an effect on her growing up in a Filipino diaspora community and seeing the fetishization of Filipino women. It was a really reflective experience, and I just can't get over how fascinating her structure and her prose was in terms of incorporating such a powerfully hateful perspective in this, and how she reclaimed this and really made it her own and fought back at something that people might think like isn't worth fighting back, because so many people say like, oh, we don't live in those times anymore, this is from the past, and she is highlighting that no, this hasn't ended. Next, I want to talk about Light in the Crevice Never Seen by Haunani K. Trask, which I was so shocked to see this on a library shelf here, literally halfway across the world from where Hawaii is. This is a collection that's really hard to find in the United States, so I was very shocked to find it where I'm currently living. But I'm very glad that I did, because this ended up being one of my favorite essay/poetry collections of the year. This is really a reflection of Hawaiian culture, language, and crises that were happening at the time that K. Trask was writing this. And I find it really fascinating that so many of the issues that she is discussing in this are issues still facing Hawaii today, and the way that she contextualizes these for the reader. A lot of this is about pushing back at the common belief in the United States that Hawaii loves the mainland because it's a source of income, but ignoring the reality of how exploitative the tourism industry is towards Hawaiian locals. So it was really interesting how there were these breaks between poems. Like she had a very emotional poem, and then would have these breaks where she's explaining the background to some of these things, and understanding that the reader may not know a lot of this information, and finding a way to bridge the gap, because the poems themselves are written using Hawaiian pidgin, and some of it is just using Hawaiian, the Hawaiian language in general, which was amazing to me to see. There is a glossary, like a translation glossary in the back, and a pronunciation guide. Loved the way that that was utilized throughout the book, though, of like putting the task on the reader of like, you should be taking something away from this book, and there are many things to take away, like not just the context, but also the language itself, and understanding the importance of these things, and why Trask was writing this in the first place. It's really sad though, because obviously reading this book I think it's been 20 years, maybe over 20 years since this was published, and understanding that so many of the things that she had hopes and dreams for that would be brought to fruition, not just for Hawaii, but for Hawaiians on a more local level of changes that she hoped to see, and unfortunately didn't, because Trask passed away a few years ago now. yeah, it was a really sad read, but also very beautiful. And I still can't believe, like, out of all the things that I would have expected to find at the library here, that was just such a shock to me, and I'm so grateful that I found it. It's made me eager to find a copy for my own shelves because it's one that I definitely think I want to reread, especially after reading more of her nonfiction work, because I hadn't actually read her nonfiction before. Now I want to look at Girls That Never Die by Safia Elhillo. This is from a Somali American poet slash author. I know that she's very famous for her book, Home is Not a Country, and I've been putting off reading that for a while. I even own a physical copy back in the United States that I just kept putting off because I had a feeling I was going to really enjoy her work, and that has made me very skeptical to read it because I'm afraid that if it doesn't live up to the expectations I set, how will I ever survive? I'm happy to say that this collection was really amazing. I picked this up just because I had a digital copy available. This was actually my day one of the Sealy Challenge, and it was quite an amazing day one because I loved this collection. A lot of it is reflecting on friendship and womanhood, and I think that these themes are explored so beautifully through Safia's poems, and it just felt like this reminder of like the community of women that are around you and how important that is, not only just within certain cultures, but also like in the experience of life and finding this type of connection with other people. It's a reminder of community and the importance of it in our mental health, our cultures, our languages, things like that. Last but not least was Minor Feelings by Cathy Park Hong. This is a nonfiction, part memoir, part more like socio-political reflection. I say this because I feel like this book really gravitates between like almost literary fiction, nonfiction, memoir, and then just commentary on things, and I really loved that about this. I thought that this blended genres so beautifully, and it's not only a discussion about what it's like to grow up as an Asian American and the Asian American experience, but it's also a lot about Asian American culture and the types of history that we're not often taught in the United States about Asian Americans. The section that I really think has stuck with me through this was her discussion about Teresa Hak Cha, or Hak Kyung Cha, I think, who is the author of Dictee, and talking about how her work has become so incredibly difficult to find. But people love to talk about how gruesome her murder was and like what exactly happened to her and all of these things. And her real reflections on women in poetry and art and literature, and how there are so many Asian American creatives who don't get the recognition that they deserve or don't get a spotlight unless like something very tragic happens to them, and how unfortunate this is. And it reminded me a lot of some of the reflections from hood feminism that I read a few years ago, where it was this kind of similar talk of like, there are these really intellectual, and not even if they are like of a super intellectual academic group, these really creative and innovative, unique thinking people who just never get the chance to actually get spotlighted, and if they do, it's for something terrible. And that's a real problem in society and the way that we value these people in society. And I think that Park Hong's exploration of this and really giving space and voice to these issues, not just to share her own thoughts and her own experiences about it, but also to really highlight these people and let them or their family members get to speak for them instead of someone else controlling the narrative, was really great. I am really excited because I put in some requests at my local library here to get some copies of her poetry collections, and they have ordered 2 of them, and I cannot wait because it's been a few months now. They told me it might take around like 6 months just because of like locational issues, but I am really looking forward to reading more of her poetry because I had no experience with Cathy Park Hong before this. I didn't realize she was a poet, and so I'm now pretty excited to get to dive into some of that. And I think that this is one kind of like Trask's writing where I'm really excited to read the poetry and then go back to Minor Feelings and look at some of like the correlations between that and her poetry, and how she's really taken these issues and explored them in a different format in her poetry. My next category is found family. And my definition of this is, I think, the classical one of like a story where like there's a group of people who are brought together, not through blood, but through love and admiration and respect for one another. This looks different though in the different stories that I want to reflect on. The first is the very irregular Secret Society of it's the Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. Such a long title. This is by Sangu Mandanna. This is a pretty well-beloved book. It's about a witch who she's making like these TikTok videos, and her community is skeptical of this because they're afraid like people are going to know witches are real, and she thinks no one will know. But this group of like I hate to phrase it like this, but like the help basically at this manor who are taking care of these three young witches reach out to her because they're like, hey, they need a teacher. And she's very skeptical of this, but she goes and helps them, and it causes this kind of reflective exploration of our main character's experience growing up, because she had always been told that witches have to grow up in isolation. They're orphans, so they grow up truly with no one. And so it's a lot of her unpacking her own trauma around this, while also being incorporated into this new family. And I thought it was so beautifully done. I really loved this story, not only because the characters were just so genuinely sweet and caring. Also, there's a romance that happens in this, and I thought it was really nicely done. Like, it felt very natural in the story and not like pushed in on top of all of these other things. I'm really excited because there is going to be, I don't think a sequel, but more of a companion novel to this that comes out next summer. It's been delayed a few times because the author has had some health issues. So I'm really glad that it has been delayed so that the author can fully recover and like spend the time that she needs with this book. Of course, I'm still eagerly anticipating it, and I can't wait to read more in this world, even if it's not a direct like sequel with the same characters coming back. Next book is a completely different type of story from the first one, where the first one was very cozy and beautiful. The second one is very tragic, still very cozy and beautiful in different ways, but I would say this is one you need to have tissues nearby for, and it is The Island at the End of Everything by Kiran Millwood Hargrave. This is actually a fictionalized middle grade book about the very real history of the Philippines and their leper colony on Culion Island. I cannot remember the exact time period this was. I think it was the 1950s and 60s, maybe even before then. There was a really bad case of leprosy that was spreading throughout the Philippines, and they basically abducted these people from their homes and forced them to go to this island where they were living in isolation. And we follow a young girl whose mother was taken here unaware that she was pregnant. On the island, there are people that have had children who don't have leprosy, or their family members ended up willingly coming to the island just to be with them. And at the start of the book, you find out that the government is requiring those people to live segregated from their families, and that any children under the age of 18, they are going to be taken to orphanages off of the island to prevent any further spread of leprosy. So we're following a young girl who is experiencing this. It's a very sad story. I still to this day can remember certain scenes from this that just really hit me in the feels. And I think it's so beautifully done because this is a story that's really hard. I mean, even as an adult, it was hard to read about some of the things that were happening at that time, but I feel like it's still very accessible for the audience it's intended for. And I think it takes a very serious issue that people may not really know about. I mean, I, as an adult who studied world history in my undergraduate degree, I know a little bit about the Philippines, but I had no idea about this. I knew that they suffered from leprosy, but I didn't know the extremes the government went to isolate people with leprosy. It was a very harrowing experience reading this, but I never felt like it was something that was inappropriate for a younger reader. The author really has a skill in doing that, because I can't imagine something so serious being so appropriate for such a young audience. And I think it's a book that is really special in that, and how it takes these very complex issues and makes them digestible and understandable to a child who may not have ever even like known about serious health issues, or may not have an awareness that these are things that people across the world throughout history have been struggling with. And now for the third and final book in this category, a third and final genre. and that is mystery, because my last pick is Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers by Jessie Q. Sutanto. This book shocked me to my core because I was not a big fan of Jessie Q. Sutanto's like Aunties series. I only read the first book. I really didn't like it. This one though, I had heard was very, very different. And a lot of people said they really loved the main character in this, so I decided to give it a chance. I listened to it on audio too, and I would highly recommend that. The narrator is absolutely amazing. Regardless, I loved this book. I loved all of the characters. I found the main character especially to be so amazing. Not only was she funny, but just it's this beautiful story of her. She's an elderly lady who feels very isolated and kind of forgotten about by her family and friends. And so one day there's this guy who ends up dead in her tea shop, and she decides she's going to investigate it herself. And so she like inserts herself into the lives of anyone who is close to him who might be a suspect, and ends up oddly bringing all of these people together. And we get these like POV narrations. I thought that was really fascinating too, because it was spliced up in a way that you are really not sure what is going on. Like, you're developing an attachment to these characters, but you're also suspicious of all of them. You feel a lot like the main character, actually, because you're seeing her investigation unfold and you're getting information and you're like, oh, Vera, I want to tell you this. But then you're also like realizing she is learning new things, and it felt like something where you were always on your toes. I didn't feel like there was necessarily a lot of red herrings in this. I thought it was a genuinely fascinating reveal of like how the mystery is solved. There's also such a beautiful discussion in this about how we treat elderly people and people who we believe like no longer offer a benefit to society. And it's not just Vera talking about this, but there are other characters that like reflect on this and their relationship with Vera in this, and how that is a contributing factor to it. And I loved how that was explored through this, because I don't think that enough stories emphasize this. And I'm just so in love with this book. I cannot wait for the sequel. It comes out in April, I think. I want to say I was recently rewatching Only Murders in the Building, and that show gives me the same vibes as this book. Like, it's the cozy mystery, but it's also the found family and the not necessarily the found family of like everybody is getting along hunky-dory. Like, everybody still has their antics and their quirks, and people get annoyed and frustrated, but it's still really beautiful when they all come together. The last category that I have is exploring grief. These are all really sad books. I cannot deny that, but they're sad in different ways, and they're exploring different types of grief. And the common theme among all of these was a different type of exploration of grief, but I think they're all unique in the ways that they've done that. So I want to start off by talking about Blood Dazzler by Patricia Smith. This is a poetry collection that is almost like a grief journal, in my opinion, reckoning with Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, which happened in the United States. And this was intense. I was very young when Katrina happened. I remember I was in elementary school, and I did not have an understanding at that age how systematically the government failed the city of New Orleans, and how a lot of that had to do with systemic racism and the contributing factors of like all of these things creating circumstances that made this event almost feel like punishment. Patricia Smith has these poems not only exploring like basically glimpses of people's experience in Hurricane Katrina, but also she includes like the National Weather Service reports and the decisions from like memos that went back and forth about FEMA and President Bush's comments and Dick Cheney's comments and like all of these things. It was so incredibly sad to see that the government knew that this was happening. They knew that this was coming. The National Weather Service had known the threat of this, and the government just kind of ignored it. They didn't believe it would be this big of a problem. They didn't believe like it was worth it, essentially, to try to save these people or to try and provide them aid. And even learning about the aftermath of it and how communities were treated in the process of like rebuilding their lives, burying their family members, all of these things, how many deaths could have been prevented in this, and that disproportionately those deaths happened to African Americans who who were just abandoned by their government, who truly offered no support in this. And yeah, it was an intense reading experience. I thought it was insanely educational, and it really made me so sad that this is not a book that is required reading in schools, because I think this would be an excellent way to explain Hurricane Katrina to younger people. And I think it needs to be explained because it is such a significant event in American history, and there's so much nuance to why this event happened. It wasn't just that it was a hurricane, it was much more nuanced than that. And these are the types of stories that deserve to be told. On a different note, I want to talk about The Wedding People by Alison Espoch. This is about a woman who goes to this resort to have this vacation that she's been putting off for many different reasons throughout her life. She is recently divorced, and she has gone on this trip with like a plan. She gets there and that is disrupted because the rest of the resort has been booked out by this wedding party. And there's all these people related to the wedding. She becomes like enraptured in the drama of this because she ends up becoming like the confidant of the bride. And it's a book that has so much reflection in it. This like interconnectedness to the wedding people causes our main character to really reflect on her life, on her marriage, what ended it, motherhood, and her inability to have children. There's so many different things that are so deeply explored in this. Like, I was genuinely shocked at how so much of this book, like, there are so many funny moments and there's so many like background storylines happening that you're aware of, but it's not always front and center. But our main character is constantly reflecting on her life. She is able to see a lot of the problems with these wedding people because she's on the outside looking in. And this makes her realize that she's never looked inside. She's never actually thought about a lot of things that really shaped her life, like how she was raised, how she found her partner, the types of friendships that she had. I just think it's such a beautiful story and a beautiful messaging of like, it's never too late to start your life over. It's never too late to have that moment where you finally can reflect on things and figure out what do you really want from life. And I found that this book was more optimistic than tragic, but it is still exploring grief. It's exploring grief in different types of grief, different types of ways, like grieving a relationship that has ended, a life you thought you were having with someone, grieving, children that you weren't able to have, and the inability to ever have that dream that you really wanted for much of your life. And that in and of itself became traumatizing at a certain point. I know that this book is really talked about and beloved already. It's one that I was worried would not live up to the hype though, and I'm so happy that it did. On a similar vein of odd stories of grief, I want to talk about Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Von Pelt. This is the story of three main characters. One is an elderly woman working at an aquarium whose son had disappeared many years before in like a boat accident. The second is a young man who is coming to the city because he has finally found out his father's name, and he is coming there to like get closer, and he ends up also working at the aquarium. And the third is a giant Pacific octopus who is enclosed in this aquarium and is trying to constantly break out of his cage because he just wants to go back to the ocean because he knows that his life is ending soon, and he just wants to go home. This was such an odd story. I never thought that I would be so emotionally attached to a fictional creature. Like, I mean, obviously octopi are real, but I never thought that I would become attached to an octopus from a story. But wow, that was one of my favorite parts of this, where the reflections that we get from the octopus on life and death, and knowing when your life is nearing its end, and debating like, what do you really want from these last few days, weeks, months, years, and what kind of life do you think you have lived, and are you hoping to live before then? We also get the perspective of our elderly main character who has experienced losing her husband just through, I think it was natural causes, and her son who she never really got answers about, and the different phases of grief that she's gone through over like the almost like 20-30 years that he's been gone, and adjusting to this new life, and realizing that grieving is still always going to be a part of it, but it just looks very different now. It was just a really beautiful look at the phases that people go through, and I just loved it. Next to our poetry collections that are kind of on similar topics, but very different perspectives on them. The first one is The Moon That Turned You Back by Hala Alyan. This is a Palestinian-American author who has been living in diaspora for a very long time now. And it's Alyan's experience writing about what has been happening in Palestine as a diasporic author. I think it was very interesting in this that a lot of this talks about the desensitization to violence and how you are just supposed to go through your everyday knowing that these unimaginable, horrendous events are happening, and how Hala Alyan has been struggling to cope with this. And this poetry collection, I've read almost all of her, I think all of her poetry collections at this point. And she's one of my favorite poets, but this one felt very experimental to me. It felt remarkably different from her previous collections, and I think that actually worked to an advantage here. I think that not only can you understand she's trying something new with these poems, but she's also trying to really dive a little bit deeper into her feelings. There's one specific poem in this that I really cannot get out of my head. It's she's like narrating her day, and then interspiced with that is like her saying, "But there's not a bomb dropping," basically. And yeah, there's just some poems in this that were really so impactful. On a similar topic to this, but a very different perspective, is Forest of Noise by Mossab Abu Toa. This is very different because it is actively talking about Palestinians who have been living through the oppressive colonial violence that is happening there, because it's a very different experience. I mean, Mossab and Halia are both obviously Palestinian, but with very different experiences, of one being in diaspora for most of their life and one living in Palestine for most of their life. And I'm glad that I read these at different times, because I think it helped me kind of understand different things about both parts of these in different ways. I will say that Forest of Noise was a lot more about the rage at the world for allowing these things to continue to happen. The knowledge that people are just sitting by and this is happening, and people are giving such terrible, awful advice about this, and people are suddenly becoming Middle Eastern, like international relations experts on Twitter and all of this stuff. There's one poem in this that I really think about all the time. It's talking about how I've seen the best minds of my generation with their brains blown out from like an explosion. Like, it's talking about how so many people are saying that Palestinians what are they going to be besides this? Like, they're always just going to be refugees. They're always just going to be this group of people that there's nothing that can be done. And he's really pushing back at this with this collection and reminding this is someone's child. This is someone that had a future. This is someone that could have done these really amazing things, and you're saying that they just didn't ever deserve a chance at that life. And how insane is that, to dehumanize a group of people so much that you think that all are just guilty by association, all are guilty of something just for existing. Whereas Hala Alyan's was much more about the desensitization to violence. Mossab Abu Toa's was much more about the actual experience of violence and the experience of literally having these things taken from you, of watching mass tragedy in front of you, of being exposed to this very traumatic experience, and then people almost gaslighting you in the aftermath and telling you well, this is what you should have done, or this is why this is happening. And there's nothing ever excusable for this happening. In any part of the world, we would not say that this was excusable. So why is this the exception? Now, last but not least, the last book of this video, which is a book that I debated even including, because I don't think that this is a perfect book. And I think that this is a book that is going to not be everyone's cup of tea. I think even reading the reviews about this, reviews seem very mixed on this book. But it's one that was very, very deeply personally impactful to me, and it was Transcendent Kingdom by Ya Gyasi. This is the story of a woman named Gifty, who I believe in the book is in her 20s and 30s at this point. But when she was much younger, in I think high school, her brother died of an opioid overdose. And her mother was never the same. Her mother struggled with mental health issues for many years, decades after. And at the start of this book, Gifty's mom needs her to take care of her, and Gifty is a PhD student in neuroscience studying addictive behaviors because she wants to try to understand why her brother fell into addiction. It's a really difficult book for me to read because when I was in high school, my brother also died of an opioid overdose. My mom also was never really the same after, not to the extent of Gifty's mom in the story, but there are a lot of things that I definitely related to and understood. And I think that's why this book for me is one of the best books of this year, because I think this book was a very cathartic reading experience. I read it around the 10-year anniversary of losing my brother, and there are so many parts of this that really spoke to experiences and questions that I had. The fact that it's always hard when it was just you and your sibling, it's always hard to find the moment to tell someone that like you had a sibling at one point and you don't anymore, but they were a part of your life and you have all these memories and experiences that for other people makes them uncomfortable if you talk about, but for you, that's your life. I mean, and struggling with a parent who is never really the same afterwards, and having to become essentially a parent for your parent, and really having to grow up before other people and mature and understand like this is just how the world works and it's not always fair, and it's really frustrating and traumatizing as well. But you have to work through it at some point. Like you have to not just work through it or cope with it, but you have to really heal from it. And a part of this book for me was healing. There are parts in this where, like, obviously Gifty had different struggles than I did, extremely different circumstances that this book is talking about, but there's still so much that I found that I had in common with Gifty, and I loved seeing this type of experience reflected in a book, because oftentimes sibling grief is not really a factor in books about grief, or even books exploring different types of grief through fictional stories or nonfiction. But the added nuances of like Gifty's lived experiences and further complications and systems of oppression that like added to this was also something that taught me a lot more about a different side of this experience. Again, I don't think that this was a perfect book. In reading some of the negative reviews, I can see why people had issues with this book. Yeah, I don't know that this is one that I would necessarily recommend to everyone. I think this might be the book that, of all the books that I've recommended, I would say you don't have to read this one. But if you've ever been through an experience like this, I think it's a book that is so beautiful and cathartic and much needed, because it's very difficult to find books that reflect this experience. I will say that this book deals a lot with religion and Gifty's kind of crisis with religion after her brother dies. I found that to be fascinating as someone that also struggled with that and ended up with very different beliefs from like what I started with when I was like raised within a religion. But yeah, it was still fascinating to me, but I understand that that could also be very hard for some people to read about. So yeah, that actually concludes all of the books that I consider my best books of 2024. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you read any of these, please leave your thoughts in the comments down below. I would love to talk more about any of these books. Thank you for watching. Bye.